Welcome back to the Art of Citizenry Podcast. I'm Manpreet Kaur Kalra, and today I'm excited to be joined by long-term collaborator and friend of the show, Anna Canning. We're kicking off something new, a series that digs into the world of private equity.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anna. Yeah, Manpreet and I have been talking for a while about how so much of what we see in our daily lives, the rising cost of housing, the quality of healthcare, even how our clothes are getting crappier, is all shaped by private equity. And yet it's something most of us rarely get a clear look at or even realize is happening.
Yeah, exactly. And it often feels like private equity is this shadowy force moving billions of dollars behind closed doors. But those decisions ripple out into our communities in ways that we just cannot ignore. That's why we wanted to bring these conversations here in a way that's accessible and grounded. And so this started really because Anna and I realized we share a dangerous love for rabbit holes, and private equity gave us so many of those rabbit holes to go through.
Oh my God, this may never end, but I think what we can promise is that we'll follow those threads where they take us. Even if we end up in some wildly unexpected places. So no guarantees, except that you're going to get our unfiltered takes, messy questions, and probably a few tangents along the way. Let's start at the foundation. What is private equity?
Yeah, so private equity at its core really refers to investment funds managed by private equity firms that raise capital from institutional investors and ultra-wealthy individuals, aka billionaires, to buy companies outright. They usually take those companies private, meaning off the stock market, so there's less public oversight.
Yeah, so in short, I guess I think of private equity as a way for these private equity bosses to gamble with other people's money, right? They get a lot of control over the company with fewer rules or accountability like you would get in a publicly traded company. And so once they buy these companies, the private equity bosses take over and either themselves run the company or install a CEO of their choosing. And then the playbook often looks the same, right? So they load the company up with debt to finance the buyout. If you've heard the term leveraged buyout, that's what they're talking about. And then restructure the company and do everything they can, basically, to extract a quick profit. I'm really interested in getting into some of these weird financial tricks that private equity bosses are doing to ensure that they keep winning their gambles. Because if we understand the playbook, more of us in our own communities can figure out how to push back.
Absolutely. And this focus on quick profits is why the private equity model is so harmful to our communities. The goal is quick, outsized returns. It's not about running a business for the long term. It's about extracting value that is fast, which might be great for investors, but often leaves workers, consumers, and communities honestly worse off.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a real consequence to this sort of strip and flip approach. The things that private equity bosses do to cut costs make our lives measurably worse. So not only do they make housing more expensive, at the same time, they're cutting corners on maintaining the buildings where people live. So, as these private equity firms are buying up more and more aspects of our lives, but quite often, unless you put in some time Googling it, it's really not visible to most of us.
Yeah, and that's why it's historically been such a backroom thing. But even though we can't see it, these opaque, high-risk deals put everyday people on the hook. We don't get a say in these deals. We live with their consequences, which is why we are talking about this right now. Private equity is expanding its reach in a way that directly impacts our lives.
Yeah, and it's not just like buying things up, right? In August, the current U.S. administration issued an executive order encouraging retirement fund managers to include private equity and other so-called alternative assets in 401ks. And on the surface, they frame it as democratizing access, so letting the common people invest their money in the way that the wealthy do. And I said earlier that private equity funds were set up so that private equity bosses are gambling with other people's money. So far, they've been restricted to gambling with the money of ultra-rich people or institutional investors. But now these billionaires are looking to reach into the pockets of ordinary people like you and me and get still more money to gamble with. And just like with a casino, where there's the saying that, the house always wins, they've been really good at rigging the system so that the private equity bosses on top keep winning.
Absolutely. And, quite frankly, with regulatory pushback mounting from antitrust to healthcare consolidation, the stage is set for private equity to deepen its reach while operating in increasingly murky waters. So now that we've laid the groundwork, this conversation is kicking off where so many of our mornings start, with our daily cup of coffee.
That's right, Manpreet. We're going to get into a tale of private equity plunder, and that's the story of Philz Coffee. And before we get into it, I'm just going to put the disclaimer out up front that I spent about 15 years working in the coffee industry, so the potential for rabbit holes on this one is high.
Absolutely. And there is a whole startup-y connection in this story. So between the two of us, I think we went down plenty of rabbit holes when preparing for this conversation. So the story started making headlines earlier this summer with the iconic Bay Area coffee chain, Philz Coffee, when they got purchased by an LA-based private equity firm, Freeman Spogli, for $145 million. The details are where you start seeing the impact of private equity, particularly on people who function as the backbones of these companies. And yes, we are talking about the workers. So here's where things get a bit complicated. The board members, which include the founder, his son, executives from VC firms, Summit Partners, and TPG Growth, which I will note is a private equity firm as well, and the current CEO, will all walk away with payouts, but the employees who purchase common stock, that same deal means that their stock will be canceled.
Wow. Yeah. So, if it hadn't been for that entire storyline around employee common stock, a lot of the story wouldn't actually have been that remarkable, right? Like, private equity firms have been on a buying spree in the coffee industry for years. In fact, as you mentioned, another PE firm had already bought a piece of Philz back in 2016. And while that influx of cash reshaped company culture, the fact that it happened in itself wasn't all that remarkable.
We've got to unpack this a bit. So the granting of stock options is a way that companies incentivize workers because they have literally used their hard-earned cash and are now invested in that company being successful. This is a common model when you have a company set up for particularly outside investment raises. So remember, most of what we can find online related to the reporting of Phil's fundraising rounds is really just whatever is available. We don't have access to Phil's capitalization table, and that's really important to remember because that's where some of the more nitty-gritty details are going to be.
And let me just jump in there because I think there's a really important distinction here that we're talking about, right? And all of this is happening in the private market, right? So, you think about like public markets, there's the stock market exchange. You can go and say, oh, this stock is trading at this amount of money on this afternoon. That just doesn't exist when you're talking in the private market. Like, the value of something, as far as I understand, is literally the number you can get people to agree on, and like their high-level fancy accountants have done that math, done some comparable things, sussed some stuff out, and then it's kind of like a little bit of maybe voodoo magic, if I understand right.
Yeah, a lot of it is assessing like what are the market trends, what is the role of this company in the market, what are its competitors, and a lot of it really is negotiations, is the valuation, right? So the big thing with situations like this is we don't necessarily know, like, was there some debt that this company had, how much debt they had, what other startup investments may have been made in the early days before formal fundraising rounds. For example, how much did founders, family, and friends invest in getting the company up and operating? Like, we don't have access to that information. And that's fine, but it does complicate our ability to be like, what happened? What's the pecking order? And so remember, as is the case with a bank, debt providers always get paid first and then everyone else. So if you have a debt provider, like you've taken out even a bank loan, or you got debt investment, which is a whole other thing, those get paid first. And so to understand this a bit more, we need to break down then the difference between common stock and preferred stock. So we've got debt that gets paid first, then you have preferred stock, and then you have common stock. Common stock is generally made available to employees of a company, whereas preferred stocks are set aside for investors. This includes venture capital, private equity. Usually they have something called a liquidation preference, which means that they have a guaranteed return in the case that the company has a change in status. That is a contractual right that preferred shareholders will receive back their investment plus any dividends or a guarantee of some multiplier of their investment. This can even be something like 2x return before common stock gets paid out. So by the time you get to common stockholders, there may not be much of that pie left, especially if there is debt that needs to be paid out. The thing to remember is you can purchase common stock and then the company can do another raise round. And when they do another raise round, they can grant more preferred stocks. So now either your stocks have been diluted because now they're creating more stocks to give, or all of a sudden you have more people who are starting to get a piece of the pie, and those people have liquidation preferences that might require them to receive 2x return, right? And so you could be someone who came in early, but there could be people that have invested larger sums because they're VCs that come in after you, and now they are going to get paid out before you.
That seems wild. So you could be, say, first in line as like some of these founding employees, but there's this system where the people with more money just get to keep on walking around you when the time comes to actually get paid out on your investment. And they've got the express track to the front of the line.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. And that's...
Wow, this seems like a rigged system. I don't know.
And that's the thing, right? The reason that preferred versus common exists is like, theoretically, investors are investing a lot of money. We're talking like in the millions or in the hundreds of thousands, right? Sure, that's a lot of money when you compare it to someone who's just putting in $10,000. But the person who's putting in $10,000, that can be a lot of money for them. So like the relative proportion of how much something is different depending on if we're talking about an individual employee who's a barista at Philz Coffee versus a VC firm that has invested in companies like Uber, right? The playing field is not even. So the proportion of which that amount is considered significant depends on who you're talking to. The big thing here to know is, in addition to being first in line for a payout, preferred stocks provide safeguards, right? And so here's the thing that a lot of people, I think, don't realize is when you join a company, you don't just get handed stocks, right? Like what usually happens is that you get stock options, and that means you're given the right to buy shares later on, but only after a vesting period. So that's the key thing, right? You don't just get stocks. You have to purchase your stocks. And you get paid out when one of two things happen. You either get bought out or you go IPO.
what we see happening here is supposed to be the good scenario, right? Like the company's getting bought. This should be a good thing. And that's like the whole thing that you're gambling on with this common stock. And from the article, it sounds like that's what a lot of workers might have been banking on.
Yeah. And what's interesting is like the practice of common stock getting canceled is more common in the case of liquidation or bankruptcy, but that's not necessarily the terminology that's being used to describe what's happening with Philz. But it's clear that the amount that Philz was then purchased for was just not sufficient, right? If we're getting to a point where common stock is getting canceled, there's just nothing left by the time we get to the employees and workers.
Yep. And I think that's what I keep coming back to, right? Is like for a private equity firm, like they may be buying this as a quote unquote distressed company or something is often the language that gets used there. But, so much of the local press comes back to the impact that has on workers, right? And there's a quote from a worker who didn't want to be named for fear of getting sued, which really gives you a sense of like the environment that they're working in there. And she'd paid $12,000 for her initial shares when the founders had first made those options available to workers in 2013. And she told the reporter, I was expecting to at least gain something of it. I committed 8 years of my life with them. When I started, there were 3 stores. When I left, there were 20 stores. And this person was clearly, deeply invested. She bought some stocks in 2013. She bought more in 2015. She helped to grow that company, both with her labor and then with her own money. And now she's left out in the cold.
Yeah. And I mean, another worker talked about how the company has changed over time, going from a place where people felt personally connected to one that was more profit driven, right? And that shift seems to have happened most starkly in 2016 when private equity firm TPG Growth led a $45 million investment round.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I started thinking about, reading all of these like rounds and dollars is like, what's happening in the timing of all of this, right? So Phil started granting employees stock options in 2013. They then closed what's called a Series A round. And then again in 2015, they did the same with employee stock options. That was part of what's called Series B round of capital raising. The thing that we don't know, obviously, is what the terms of those contracts were. Did employees understand the risks associated with that investment? All of that. Anyhow, so what else is happening? That was my little rabbit hole. And, not surprising, these stock options really coincided with a big expansion in the company. So up until 2013, Philz Coffee was just a Bay Area company. They had locations all over like San Francisco Bay Area. Then with this new injection of cash from their first round of investor and employee funding, they began to open up new stores in Southern California.
Yeah, and now seems to be a good time to pause and talk about private equity versus venture capital, because VC firms tend to invest early in the startup phase of a company. Phil's case is pretty typical of what these investors do. They invest in a company so the company can grow and expand. The thing investors are most interested in is a company's exit strategy, right? Meaning that their goal is to get bought out or go public, because that is how investors make money. Now, private equity firms, on the other hand, tend to invest in more mature companies that are past the risky startup phase. They tend to buy up a controlling share of the company and be a lot more hands-on in managing it. And a key part of this is because they look to make their money back through operational changes, right? So you and I have talked about the idea of cost cutting, reducing hours for workers, all those different pieces. And that is usually these very extreme measures to scale back and scale down how the business is operating.
That's right. And another thing I think I'd say about venture capital, from my less deeply educated than your perspective, is just that in my mind, it's super connected with tech, right? Like venture capitalists are always out there looking for the big, hot, emerging new thing where they can like get in on the ground floor and take risks and then sell big, right? Like over the past decade, I think the precise trends come and go. Like a decade ago, it was software, right? Then it was biotech. Now it's AI. And all of these things have made up around half of these venture capital investments. And food and beverage has always been a pretty small sliver of that. Comparatively, I think it's under 10% when I looked it up. But Philz is in this really interesting little space where they're like so tied to this tech culture as well. A lot of the coverage of them actually, like as I was doing research for this episode, was coming from tech outlets. So there's like a 2015 article from the site TechCrunch that's calling them, Silicon Valley favorite, and Forbes dubs them Silicon Valley's cup of choice.
Yeah, and these articles are so breathlessly enthusiastic, right? Like the Forbes one starts with a description of Mark Zuckerberg's wedding and how the founder of Philz was in on the secret ceremony and actually served drinks there. I mean, great. You've got cool friends. And I don't even know if I think Zuckerberg is really that cool. But anyways, and then how it is the coffee of choice sold to Twitter and Salesforce headquarters. Silicon Valley loves its unicorns, right? And I think that, that is all premised on really strong PR, and that requires some deep money.
Wild. In this era, right, I mentioned that I was in coffee, and I swear at one point I went to some session at a conference where Philz was there and they were talking about their training program for staff and how it's like the coffee equivalent of Apple's training program. And, that part, Philz University, as they called it, was Apple influenced. That is absolutely for real. They actually maybe hired some guy from Apple to design that. I could not find the actual receipts for the fact that they presented at a conference on that. I went to a lot of conferences once upon a time. That was a minute ago. But I think it really fits into this idea of like how they were talking about this culture in this sort of earlier period before they really got going in growth. And I mentioned that 2015 TechCrunch article earlier. There's an extended quote from Jacob Jabber, who is the founder's son, went on to be the CEO, and he talks really extensively about it, right? We feel like we have something special, and we want to share this experience with more people without diluting quality. I talk about it as shareability instead of scalability. And the way to do that is to recognize that the most important people in the company are behind the counter, and that the store leader who is in charge of the store, we invest in them heavily and create a culture of ownership.
Yeah, the irony. Workers were in fact investing in the company and literally funding its growth.
I mean, coffee was just like such a weird and buzzy industry at that time that in that 2016 Forbes article, Jacob Jabber is also quoted talking about his ambition to, disrupt the coffee industry, in which, that famous like tech innovation term, right? We're going to disrupt the coffee industry. And his goal was to grow to 1,000 stores nationwide. I think at that time they had like maybe 40 or something stores. And I looked it up. Starbucks around that time was somewhere in the 8,000 store range. So they weren't shooting that big, but they were still shooting really big compared to where they were. And, there was just this moment in coffee, right? Like Philz was definitely in with tech people, but, they weren't the only ones also. Like there were a lot of coffee companies getting all this venture capital money, tech money, and expanding super rapidly. A lot of them are household names now, or sort of household names, depending on your household, I guess. But like Blue Bottle Coffee was a Bay Area coffee. They expanded a ton. They're now actually owned by Nestle. Stumptown in my hometown of Portland is now owned by JAB Holding Company, which is absolutely massive German firm. And, the list goes on and on and on.
Yeah, antitrust, corporate consolidation, whatever you want to call it, it's rampant. I feel like most of the well known coffee names that make these big PR splashes end up being bought out. I remember when I lived in LA in 2011, Intelligentsia coffee was all the rave. Everyone would want to meet up at Intelligentsia. And then not long after, they were bought out by Pete's, which was then bought out by JAB. And Pete's just got bought from JAB by Keurig Dr. Pepper. I mean, this is total chaotic web of mergers and acquisitions, right? And clearly I've gone down my share of rabbit holes as promised. But to get back to the crux of it all, when we talk about corporate consolidation, we are really pointing to is the way ownership and decision-making power gets concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. That means the landscape is shaped by these multinationals who often have profit-driven motivations because they have shareholders that expect that. And that is a huge challenge for small-scale and ethical businesses. They are a small fish trying to survive in a game that is increasingly shaped by big business. And the thing in coffee that I think is important for people to remember is that just because a coffee place is considered part of the third wave coffee movement doesn't mean that they are small, independent, and ethically sourcing their beans. Consolidation really narrows the space for independent businesses to thrive.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, really concretely, I remember back in that era as these big specialty coffee brands were consolidating. There was word that as some of these coffee companies were using their increased power over their supply chain partners and demanding longer and longer terms to pay their bill, right? So smaller roasters were getting billing terms of maybe like net 15, net 30 days to pay their importer for the coffee that they bought and then roasted and sold onward, But these mega roasters were then pushing through demands to pay importers like net 180 days, even net 230. So that's almost 6 to 8 months after they'd taken possession of that coffee to pay for it. And access to cash is obviously like a huge thing pretty much across the business world. But I feel like it's really concrete and critical in coffee, right? So for farmers, coffee is this crop that's mostly just harvested once a year. And those small scale farmers, they have to make their money last from one harvest up till the next. And then at every step, the various intermediaries, the importer, the roaster, they all have to get cash to pay for these coffee beans as they bring them into their own inventory. And this was this era where, you'd also see some of these smaller ethical coffee roasters that I think you're talking about, right? Like talking about the importance of offering pre-harvest financing to these farmers that they bought from, right? So essentially loaning money or offering prepayment against the crop so that they wouldn't actually have on hand for months, trying to ease the burden of the lean months between crops on farmers. And that example has really stuck with me since then. Like, I feel like in the scheme of things, right, we're all pretty aware of the advantages that a giant company has in terms of distribution, economies of scale, and all of that. But this just feels like it's one more way in which that cash on hand and the system is really stacked to push risk down to the people at the bottom with the least leverage, right? And so maybe that's these common stock holding workers, maybe that is coffee farmers, but there's just like all of these financial instruments that are really built to push risk down and pull profits up.
Yeah. And that really gives a picture of just how unequal this whole thing is at every stage.
Absolutely. And while we're on this history digression, I'm just going to also add that in those years, coffee had all this cachet here among tech bros and all that. At the same time, things were absolutely not going well for coffee farmers. So in 2018, the coffee commodity market price hit historic lows of the last decade or so. That was somewhere around 90 cents a pound for most of that year. And at that time, So the Specialty Coffee Association did some research, and they were estimating that the threshold for profitability for coffee farmers was more than double that at $2.50 a pound.
That's a staggering figure. It's estimated that just 10% of the value of coffee stays in the countries where it is grown, which really underscores the way that the economics of the industry are intertwined with colonialism.
That's right. That brings us back to two of our favorite topics, colonialism and capitalism. So here we are. We are back in this super buzzy time of coffee in the US. Then CEO of Philz, the founder's son, Jacob Jaber, is promising absolutely massive expansion, taking this Bay Area chain national with, talk of coffee shops on both coasts. There are so many interviews with him from all these years where he's laying out all kinds of plans. And, some of them come to pass, some don't. He's throwing around names of all these different cities where they're going to go. I think at their peak, it seemed like there were about 100 coffee shops. So this was definitely their growth era. And then things started to go sideways.
Yeah, it's always hard to pinpoint exactly when a company starts to decline. I feel like sometimes the indicators are they putting on sales all the time? Because that's probably not great. It's not like companies are putting out press releases when they lose money, right? And privately held companies don't have to disclose earnings. But in 2021, Phil and his son Jacob, who had been acting as CEO, stepped down from the company. And soon after, the company started closing down the stores that had opened on the East Coast.
Yeah, so the 20-teens were these years where there were all the long interviews with one of the Jabers about the value of people, the value of personal connection, and all of that.
Oh, those feel-good stories.
The stories of the 2020s were really different. So there's this long string of stories, and it feels like they hit kind of the zeitgeist of every one of these moments, right? So in 2020, workers walked out of California stores over COVID safety concerns, which became a labor dispute, which escalated and ended with Phil's management sending out a mass email laying off over 180 people, according to the Mission Local.
Yeah, and then months later, more workers were fired over disagreements with the company's policies about giving discounts to the police in the midst of the protests that were following the murder of George Floyd. A number of staff spoke out, expressing that they felt like the policy was at odds with the company's image, which it clearly seems to be, especially if they're going to be putting Black Lives Matter posters and flags on their social media and store walls. I mean, come on, let's have some consistency, people. But some classic corporate co-option of social justice, as we've discussed in a previous episode of this podcast, which I am going to plug. Go check out episode 33.
Right. And then 2023, the company announced that it was going to close its very first store, which was located in the Mission District of San Francisco. The initial story from management was that they were closing the store because their landlord wasn't renewing their lease. But workers were pretty quick to call BS on that excuse because Jacob Jaber, the former CEO, was the one who owned the LLC that owned that building, which is really kind of Superman or Spider-Man meme vibes. We're just all, pointing at each other here. Instead, workers were speculating that the company didn't want to invest in the maintenance that would be required to modernize the building and get rid of the rat issue that was apparently a thing. Yeah. And so, the coverage of it gives you that kind of choice detail. And then also, really gives you a sense as workers were explaining how over the past few years, the vibe of the store had increasingly become more, we're here to make money for our investors over focusing on the community and all of that had been really kind of an animating force for years. And that they felt like management was just willing to shutter a location that did plenty of business just to cut those kind of costs.
And then I believe, if I remember correctly, that in 2024, workers at their Berkeley store decided to unionize. And you know how much I love a good unionization story as well. So Phil's management pulled out all the stops, pulling workers into one-on-one meetings, threatening not to pay legally owed wages, threatening to close down the store, all the things classic to the union busting playbook. And against the odds, the workers won their election, but have yet to successfully negotiate a first contract. Stalling is also a classic tactic. And so here we are. We have a brand with name recognition that's struggling. And in the world of capitalism, where the goal is to always grow, 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 stores are closing.
Yeah, that story arc, I feel like it is so common in businesses that are bought up by private equity firms, right? Like the business is maybe headed down, even in bankruptcy, but there's a name associated with it, like a brand that people recognize. And the goal is then to milk that brand for all it's worth.
During their last major raise, which was a Series C investment round, they raised $45 million from TPG Partners in September 2016, which is not long after their $15 million Series B raise in February 2015, which to an outsider would seem like, whoa, the company is growing and growing fast. But remember, it's a private company now with investors who are looking for the company to offer some return. So by the time you hit a Series C round, investors are in the mindset that a lot of capital has been pumped into this business to make it grow.
My big takeaway here, once again, so often happens in these private equity deals that regular people are the ones left holding the bag and absorbing the risk. Well, the rules of the financial system are really built to protect the wealthy.
Yeah, and so a little postscript to the story. After the initial Mission Local story hit the internet, there was outrage about the cancellation of employee common stocks. And of course, correlation doesn't equal causation. But after 2 weeks, Philz announced that the current employees would be receiving a thank you bonus paid by Philz Coffee, supported by Freeman Spogli. Now, this bonus doesn't cover those old school former employees, the ones we talked about earlier who had invested thousands into a company a decade ago.
Yeah, but even the workers who got that money, they were pretty spicy about the deal too. There's one quoted who says, "We'd rather be given hard-earned raises instead of 3 tanks of gas," which gives you a sense of like how far that money goes. You actually get a lot more money if you get even a small raise over a period of time, as opposed to something that's going to be taxed at a higher rate as a bonus and covers 3 tanks of gas these days. Inflation. We love it.
Yeah. And then, the other thing that changed in those 2 weeks was that initially the current CEO claimed that he would reinvest some of the money from his payout back into Philz. Soon after, Philz announced that he would be reinvesting 100% of his after-tax proceeds back into the company. All right. So we went from a portion to 100%. Of course, there's no real transparency about how much he and the other executives stand to receive from the deal, nor are there any accountability measures to ensure that follow through on these commitments. But it does feel like a testament to the power of journalism and informed citizenry to speak truth to power and effect at least some change, of course.
CEOs should be made more ashamed more of the time. But in all seriousness, right? In this era of corporate impunity, which I feel like is a phrase I say a lot lately, I think that there is something we can hold on to here, right? Like these CEOs are happy to cash in. They're happy to screw over working people. But when we, muckraking journalists, the researchers, the activists, when we all do a little digging and shed light on their tricks, turns out they really don't like that.
Yep, that's right. And that's definitely part of our goal here, but also really the mission of Art of Citizenry as an independent platform. This is part of why all the episodes that we put together are the way that they are. We're trying to uncover and really shed light on some of the narratives that get lost. And so in spirit of that reveal, what did you find in your research about Freeman Spogli?
Oh my gosh. I found all sorts of things. let's start on one of my little high notes. When reporting on this story, the coffee industry trade magazine Sprudge called Freeman Spogli what Thomas Pynchon or David Foster Wallace might name a private equity firm. And I have to say, that gave my occasional literary nerd tendencies a good laugh because it is absolutely not wrong. And then I did my other favorite thing, which is also pretty nerdy, and that is go on a history deep dive. So Freeman Spogli was founded in 1983, originally as Riordan, Freeman, and Spogli. So Richard Riordan quit the firm in 1988, first to pursue bigger, more leveraged buyouts of more established companies, and then to become the most recent Republican mayor of Los Angeles in 1993. So he moved on to more illustrious things, maybe? I don't know. The other two founding partners, Bradford Freeman and Ronald Spogli, are also both great examples of exactly how these wealthy private equity bosses are deeply intertwined in our political system.
Yeah, Ronald Spogli is such an example of how all these upper levels of business and politics are intertwined and all about who you know, right? So he was George W. Bush's roommate when they were both at Harvard Business School. Spogli went on to work for an investment bank firm that later got absorbed into Morgan Stanley before he founded Freeman Spogli. And then before he was tapped by George W. Bush to become, wait for it, the ambassador to Italy.
Amazing. Who says money doesn't pay in politics? Bradford Freeman was also a buddy and a top fundraiser for George W. Bush. And I found this amazing ancient website from the 2000 campaign with these pioneer profiles of Bush's top donors. So Freeman has one of these profiles. And then it gives his little bio talking about, as an architect of $100 million deals, he, Freeman, takes great offense at the notion that Bush's campaign is being bankrolled by the super rich. People talk about special interests, he scoffs. How can you have special interests when you have 170,000 donors? Try 212 pioneers raising more than $21 million. And I just want to say, 212 people raising over $21 million averages out to about 100,000 each, which kind of contradicts the notion that they're not super rich. But okay, Freeman. And then his whole argument that it's not a pay-to-play special interest field system really is contrasted interestingly with an interview that he did circa 2016. So Freeman's there and he's talking about, how he personally donated more than $1 million to the Bush campaign. And so then after the election, he gets this call from the man himself. And he's like stoked on this, right? He's got big ambitions. He hopes maybe he's going to get tapped to run the CIA because apparently that's what businessmen want to do. But instead, Bush gets him on the phone and I'm summarizing, but he basically says like, hey man, I can't bring my cat to the White House. You seem to like the cat. Want it? And so when Freeman was asked what he got in return for his donations, his response was, I got the frickin' cat. So I guess the moral of the story is it doesn't always pay to play or that cats are worth $1 million, just your takeaway. But after that, I truly ended up in the rabbit hole of his political contributions, and they're amazing. He's given millions for years to Republicans across the country. The Bush dynasty is absolutely still one of his top remaining causes. If there is a Bush who has run for office, it seems like he has given them money. But he did also find money to throw at J.D. Vance and had some money left over to block a California ballot initiative that would have taxed the ultra-rich to make a free public preschool program across the state.
So these are the guys at the top of Freeman Spogli. So as a firm, they describe themselves as specializing in middle market consumer brands, including restaurants and services and distribution. So in that way, Philz Coffee seems to fit right into their portfolio.
Yeah, although I gotta say, it seems like a bit of a come down for a brand that was once all about defining third wave coffee to now be lumped into a portfolio which has over the years included Popeye's chicken and cinnamon, but all right.
Yeah, private equity definitely makes for some strange bedfellows.
And in another twist that seems really relevant to this story and our digressions on consolidation, right? So Freeman Spogli got their start in the 1980s, and one of their first things was a whole string of leveraged buyouts with supermarkets. So throughout the 80s, they were buying up regional chains, most of which have names that are long gone since they've already been bought up by others. And, this is fascinating because I think it really reflects some of what was going on during this period. Going into the 80s, most of these supermarkets were unionized. And the people who worked there, they had good union jobs, they had actual pensions for retirement. And then coming out the other side of this string of acquisitions, these companies managed to slough off those pension obligations and reduce those union jobs.
Yeah, the numbers are really staggering. I think in 1992, the top 4 grocery stores controlled less than 16% of the market. Today, Walmart alone has more than 21% market share, and the top 4 grocery chains control almost 45% of the market.
And to think that Freeman Spogli was there at the beginning. The story just goes on and on.
One of the threads that runs through this Philz story is the theme of corporate consolidation. As fewer and fewer companies own more and more of the market, it takes more money to even try to compete. And there are few people at the top who are controlling a lot of money. So in order to try to keep up, there's the need to get some of that money. But with that money, companies then lose control of their business to investors. And the priority becomes more about satisfying investors' desires for profit over their stakeholders, customers, or workers. And that's how you see companies that claim to be mission-driven end up in complete odds with that mission. The board of these companies are shaped by their investors, and investors are just looking out for their own return. While Philz wasn't legally required to protect common stock employee investments, the decision to not do so speaks volumes about where workers fit in the hierarchy of corporate priorities. It's a moment that could have demonstrated real loyalty and accountability to the very people who helped build the brand, but instead became another story of consolidation at the expense of workers.
The way that the Philz story played out is just such a blatant illustration of all of this. For now, Philz has a statement that the company will continue to operate as it has historically in terms of jobs, wage, benefits, and all those things, and that there are an exciting pipeline of new store openings planned over the next 24 months. But I think we have to see what that really means in practice, right? It is totally possible to be opening new stores while reducing staffing in existing stores and making fewer people do more work. And honestly, it is absolutely part of the private equity playbook.
One of the other takeaways for me from this story is how absolutely vital the role is of local and independent media. We really wouldn't have been able to do this episode without the reporting of Mission Local. They have covered what's been happening at Philz Coffee for years from the perspective of the people who work there and local communities. So with that, thank you, Anna, for joining me in this conversation. Art of Citizenry is entirely listener-supported. I truly hope you consider contributing to it by visiting artofcitizenry.com/support. Please remember to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and give it 5 stars. Thank you to our producer, Ali Anna Ray, and editor, Stephen Blevins. Original theme music is by Katrina Zemrak.